better spot to have a discussion like tonight's discussion on fake news than in the center of Thomas Jefferson's house. I appreciate you all coming out tonight. I have a few brief introductory remarks, and I'll turn it over to our moderator, John Augusta, who will walk us through this. Should be interesting, relevant, and engaging talk. I would like to welcome, of course, John and Dr. Herbst and Caroline Glickman from the News in Advance for joining us tonight to have this discussion. And John has been the moderator now. This is your second program with us, and we're happy to have him back. And of course, tonight's talk is on fake news, now and in Jefferson's time. Believe it or not, fake news is not new. It is something that has gone through American history and world history. And the panel tonight will be discussing it in several ways. One, obviously, a political discussion about politicians using that term, but also the fact that, as we found out today through some congressional hearings, that foreign countries are using things like fake news to influence our election or other elections around the globe. So it's really an interesting, juicy topic. Jefferson dealt with as well. But I thought I'd share just a few brief Jefferson quotes to start the mood right before I introduce our moderator. Jefferson, of course, wrote quite a bit about free press, and this is one of my favorites. And he writes that, but the only security of all is the free press. It is necessary to keep the waters pure. Note that he wrote to Lafayette in 1823. And then this is something that probably ebbs and flows through American history, but the whole art of government consists of the art of being honest. And that's from 1774. Yeah, exactly. And this is the one I think that is very fitting for tonight's discussion, and every program that we do on Pop Before us, that every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. So that's sort of the guiding factor for this type of discussion here tonight. So with that, I'd like to introduce John Augusta, who is a visiting professor of history at Randolph College. He's a historian, a lawyer, and award-winning author. He's taught law and history at the University of Virginia, George Washington University, Oberlin, Hamilton, and Randolph Colleges, his current post. Dr. Augusta has held fellowships at the International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello and is currently a fellow at the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities. And he's also an author, a book called Religious Freedom, Jefferson's Legacy, America's Creed, which was released in 2013. And Wellspring of Liberty, How Virginia's Religious Dissenters Helped to Win the American Revolution and Secured Religious Liberty, that was back in 2010. And his latest work is on Patrick Henry, Proclaiming a Revolution, which was released last year. It's always wonderful to have John with us, so I'll turn it over to you, John, to begin the discussion. Thanks.
You know, as Jeff mentions, Jeff, thank you, and thank you to Pop Before us for having us on a very important topic. It is interesting that this is not only a topic that was relevant in Jefferson's time, the phrase fake news was actually used back in the early 19th century, so it's interesting that parallel. At the same time, I think one of the things we'll talk about before we're done tonight is one has to be very careful in drawing comparisons between the 18th century and the 21st century. There are also great many differences. As we were talking about this panel, the issue of fake news is really fairly complex in some respects. For one thing, we have flip sides of a coin. We have the problem of simply making things up sometimes, rather bizarre comments about massacres in Bowling Green or wiretaps, and creating those as if they are true. We also have an equally troubling problem of taking true things that one disagrees with and calling that fake news. And what does this do to our national dialogue, and is it dangerous? But let me begin to introduce our panelists. On my right, your left, Caroline Glickman, managing editor of the Lynchburg News in Advance. She's been in journalism for quite some time, since she graduated from Syracuse at the Charlotte Observer, and then returning to, I'm told, her hometown, Lynchburg, to become city editor at the News in Advance before becoming managing editor in 2013. On my left, your right, Jeffrey Herbst is president and CEO of the Museum, which, if you haven't been to the museum, very interesting place in Washington. It used to be in Arlington when I was there, now in Washington. Before that, Jeff was the president of Colgate University. He has also taught at Princeton, his alma mater, and did his graduate work at Yale. He is the author of a number of books and articles, which I will not list at this point. But let's go ahead and get started with what we hope is an interesting conversation. Jefferson has a number, Jeff said, a number of quotes that are relevant to this. One that Jeff doesn't mention is Jefferson says at one point that if I have to choose between a government without newspapers or newspapers without government, I wouldn't hesitate to choose the latter. So he seems to think that newspapers are very important. So I might start with that, maybe a relatively easy question. What is the role of journalism? Carol, we can start with you. When we talk about fake news and its impact, why is journalism important?
Well, my whole career has been nothing really but this, and doing it here in my hometown, I think it just resonates with me maybe more than it did when I was in Charlotte. I mean, the newspaper, we're your meeting place, we're your town square, we're the place that puts the face on your community and on the news. We're present when you can't be. I think a good newspaper, I hope it's got a heart and soul and a sense of humor, just like a good community would. And of course we're there, we like to think we're there to keep the powerful accountable and all of those things that of course are fundamentally important, but I would say that we are you, and through what we do, we're the, help me out here, Jefferson talked about the Republic being important at a community level.
The word Republicans.
And that's who we are. So if we're not, so when we think about, and I'm sure I'm getting ahead of myself now, but when we think about the challenges of fake news and sort of the drip of that into our community, it's worrisome because if we're the community meeting place and you trust us and we don't want to take that for granted, then that's great. But if you don't trust us, then, and I had a column about this in the paper a little while ago, I would just ask, where are the moorings for your community discourse, if not from a trusted source, we hope, like your hometown newspaper?
Jeff, the same issue. President Trump has referred to some of the mainstream media as the enemy of the people. Is that, set aside who says it, is that kind of idea a concern?
Well, I think that kind of idea is a concern, but the newspapers, as we conceive them, and the conception has changed over time. There's always been a certain amount of built-in conflict with the government, because if you're going to hold people accountable, which I think most people believe is one of the central functions of journalism, which goes beyond these days, of course, newspapers, the presupposition there is that there's something to worry about. If we believe that government was inhabited by angels, we wouldn't worry about accountability mechanisms. So you set it up for conflict. The other thing I'd say, and we can develop this as it goes along, that Jefferson was worried about a government without newspapers, and part of it was because he and the other founders saw newspapers as part of the system of keeping government honest, and that's why free press is in the First Amendment. He also said it, I think, because even back then there were real worries about the economic viability of the news. Benjamin Franklin, associate, established the post office in good part to subsidize newspapers, because even then it wasn't a very good business.
Great business.
And one of the things we're seeing today is the economic foundation of the news is being challenged in very profound ways, and there are many and I think that's actually the overriding story. There are many pathologies of that, including fake news.
I think Jeff's final comment is very interesting, because if the economics of what we think of as journalism is challenged, and that creates new veins of information which we may not think are subject to the standards of journalism, is it the economics that's driving part of this? Madison says, by the way, we talk a lot about Jefferson, and the people of Montpelier always get upset if I don't throw Madison. He doesn't get the same kind of press. He talks about the press as the effective guardian of every other right because of this fourth estate idea that, it's one thing to have government, but that doesn't work. And this is what Jefferson was saying. That doesn't work if you don't have this other thing. But Jeff's point, there's tension. There's an actual tension. Well, let's jump right in then to the fake news issue. How serious of a problem, Carolyn?
Well, prior to, I'd say October, I didn't get any, no phone calls, no emails, anything really about that. And then all of a sudden, we started to. And I would say now, a couple times a week, we've had people, we certainly have had people cancel their newspapers over it. I also know that we've had people start their subscriptions over it because they want to support us, so that's wonderful, and I tend to think along with that. So for me, it's it's the bias that's in the news, and I'll hear from people, not so much about, well, do you like Carolyn, your local news, yeah, it's okay, but they're worried about what they're reading in the Associated Press, which every newspaper uses, or the Washington Post, which is doing all kinds of good work right now. And if they see that in the paper, there are some members of our public who just don't believe it, and so we hear about that, so I worry, as I said before, that that's so the problem of what people are choosing to believe is the fact. To me, I've always been raised that a fact is a fact is a fact. It just is. It's not something that you believe or don't believe. So if you extend that into, if that's where it is now, I worry a great deal about when it will be us and the work that we're doing in our community.
So it's expanding. Do we even have a sense of when we talk about fake news? Isn't part of the problem we have a disagreement about what the fake news is?
No, I think most people would say in the current context, fake news is deliberately false information that's been weaponized, if you want to use that word, to spread through social media. But the bigger context is this has always been a concern. In the 1890s there was yellow journalism, which may have gotten us into the Spanish-American War and may have contributed to the assassination of President McKinley. If you think that deliberately false news is a recent phenomenon. And the challenges to the media go way, way beyond this. And I happen to think the structural forces underneath are more important. Trust in the media has been declining for 25 years. That's an important statement, but in fact, trust in all American institutions except the military has been declining for 25 years. So it's not like people started recently to wonder what was going on. Their concerns are bias, incomplete information, and the polarization of American society. And then part of the fake news thing is the news has changed fundamentally in really the last 10 years. Even 10 years ago, and certainly 25 years ago, there were a couple of gatekeepers, 3 nightly network news, and a couple of major newspapers that determined at least the national news agenda, not necessarily the local news agenda, but the national news agenda. At the museum, we just celebrated the centennial of Walter Cronkite. He said that's the way it was, and for a great many Americans, that's the way it was. I'm not romantic about that time. You had 5 guys, basically, all white, all from the Northeast, all with their particular biases, determining the news agenda for the population. What's happened today is there are no more barriers to entry to the news information system. Anyone can go in and have a following. The Washington Post is my local paper. It's not much of a local paper, but my local paper. Has a printed daily circulation of 320,000. There are teenagers, 17-year-olds on YouTube who have followings of 10 million. And they got those 10 million followers for free, by the way, with no monetization. And I think that's great. There are all these people posting, tweeting, all this information. I want to find out what's happening in India. I can use my phone and read the Times of India. I've never done that before. My own area of academic specialty focuses in good part on South Africa. There's a crisis there right now because the president fired the finance minister a few minutes ago. Before I walked in, I was looking at what was happening in real time with the rand-dollar exchange rate. So all these new entrants, but lo and behold, some of the new entrants want to pollute the ecosystem and distribute false news, sometimes for political reasons, largely for commercial reasons, and we're not used to that. We're still, in our minds, we're still used to the gatekeeper model, but the world has changed completely on us. And I think what's going to happen is the consumer is going to have to become a lot more intentional and demanding, because this is only the tip of the iceberg in terms of who's going to enter and produce news in the years to come.
Jeff mentioned social media, Carolyn. How do we it seems to be a conundrum. And by the way, it's one, we want to come back to the 18th century, which is more my area, and Jefferson's grappled in some ways with similar things. That we don't want a gatekeeper who's restricted, and yet we know that damage can be done through this pollution by economic forces, making it so much easier to enter and so much harder to maintain something like the Post or the news event. How does social media affect this, affect your newspaper?
Well, the horizontal delivery of the news, which is by and large what social media is tremendously exciting. I mean, we're able to, we can report a story in 100 different ways now because of that. And it's social media is, responsible for, in oppressed countries where it still gets out that way. It's also responsible for who was the guy who went to the Washington Pizza Parlor acting on fake news. I mean, so they're both like two sides of the same coin. But I don't have the idea that people can be more informed than ever before because of social media, because of what they're reading on Facebook. What are the numbers on it? Like half, 51% now say they get their news through Facebook, right? That's tremendously exciting. It's just figuring out how to harness it and how to help people be perhaps more to raise the level of media literacy. I think is something I know we're talking about in my newsroom, and has ramifications certainly for all of our reporters. We talk about maybe we need to be in my newspaper. We need to be more assertive about letting people know how we long have reported the news and how we move from fact to fact to fact to fact, as a mentor of mine used to say. So maybe we need to be a little more transparent about how we do what we do, and that will help people have more faith in how we do it. But social media, wow, what a genie out of the bottle. It's tremendously exciting.
I want to come back to, Carolyn mentions media literacy. We talk about this a lot from the historic academic side, the role of historians to give people the tools to understand how to use these things. But Carolyn mentioned something very important, and I don't want to let it slip. Social media, on one hand, brings us Pizzagate, was that which is an abomination. I mean, a guy walks into the AR-15, starts shooting up some poor pizza folks. Social media at the same time gives us the Arab Spring because the government can't control that news source in Egypt, in Tunisia. So it is a complicated issue.
I just say they're not really balanced. I mean, social media enabled tens of millions of people to be informed and to challenge, in part, it wasn't the whole story, their governments. And one guy on the other side. Now, there are other manifestations of fake news that I wouldn't say they're balanced.
Well, I guess I wouldn't say they're balanced, but I think we don't want to minimize. I mean, Pizzagate is one awful incident, and it's one very specific thing. I agree to say that fake news has potentially broader ramifications. What about the problem that media literacy is part of this? One of the things that concerns me, and this may be with the speed of social media, it may be simply the speed of the news today, is you can't correct things anymore because it's too late. So, for example, Kelly Conway talks about Bowling Green Massacre, and it doesn't matter that you come back later and say, oh, that was a confusion, that was wrong, because it's too late, it's out there. Nunes backs down on Trump was monitored, but it's too late. You've released the news. Is there any way, so the speed of media is also helpful?
I guess I disagree with that. I mean, the old days, what was a correction in the newspaper? Someone would write it, the mail would take a couple of days, and then they would print the New York Times on page 2, a small retraction to an article that people had forgotten about. When Kellyanne Conway said Bowling Green Massacre, instantly on Twitter, there was a correction. So I think you see corrections in real time now, when in the past, I think newspapers were actually far less accountable because it was just slow.
Does it do any good?
Oh, I think absolutely. I mean, I think that's why there was a lot in the old era that was good. There were a lot of problems in the way journalism was practiced, in part because it was a different technology. But today, when a newspaper corrects something on its website, the correction appears with the original article. That's much more powerful than in the old days when the correction
But it feels good when, not the part where you make something, when you make a mistake, but boy, it feels good when you can go online, you can give the story, you can fix it, you can say you fixed it. It just helps. But we've been careful these past many years, but not from the very beginning. You can't go in and just change something without saying that you have changed it and there is a correction. And boy, if you ever notice that the News in Advance has done that, call me right away. You try hard not to, but that's and then we also will run the same, a version of it in the print edition too. But it just, I'm just saying from an editor's point of view, it just feels good to get it straight.
All right, approach the question of fake news from a different perspective. We've already talked about this a little bit, but other folks are on. I raise the question of, is the media, the change in the media over the last 10 or 20 years partially responsible for this phenomenon, in this sense that the media has become more partisan, more openly partisan. I'm thinking Ted Koppel telling Sean Hannity that you're hurting America by having people more focused on ideology than facts. And by the way, Jefferson would be talking about that's the problem with the news in the 18th century. And at the same time, we have some media networks who've specifically built their power, their economic power, on a model of fear, anger, distrust, paranoia, which then affects the news we hear and affects our hearing of that news. Is it a chicken or the egg problem, or does the media partially create this problem?
I think that there's no question that the distrust that has grown in the media over the decades is harming in one way or another.
Don't stop.
Well, by that I mean that, I think that Fox News grew into what it is because the media wasn't hearing the full voice of America. It probably still isn't. So yeah, and that we would certainly be responsible for something.
Well, I think the media has changed, the American public has changed, and I tend to think that markets respond to demand. If you look at it, if you look at Pew Foundation surveys, and when they array people who call themselves, let's say, very conservative, somewhat conservative, neutrals, somewhat liberal, very liberal, there's been a drift to both poles in American society. There are more people who code themselves as very conservative, and there are more people who code themselves as very liberal. And the middle has hollowed out to some extent. And I think what we're seeing is that those people maybe they're moving there partially because of the media, but maybe they're moving there because that's where they think they belong. And the media is supply always follows demand, is supplying them with things that they value. I happen to believe that Fox rose up because they perceived a gap in the marketplace and filled it. That's part of the kind of political economy of our country. So whether they, I don't think they drove, however, these divisions so much as they were already there, and there was just a gap in the market.
Does media have a responsibility? I'm thinking back, I mentioned Fourth Estate in response to something Jeff had mentioned very early on. Does media have a responsibility to stand above, beyond those market influences of what people want to hear in their media?
Well,
If media is going to be a watchdog for the country, for the republic, as Jefferson saw it, is there a demand to go beyond that market impulse?
Well, so we solved this problem in previous generations at the major national newspaper level by having the newspapers owned by families, the Grahams, the Salisburys, the Chandlers, who own major newspaper properties and had a conception of that they could run the newspapers, make some money, but not squeeze every last dollar out of it, and still align themselves with the public good. So that was the model at the national level. And model at many local levels, where family-owned newspapers kind of were something of a buffer between absolute market forces. And then they agonized over how they could run viable properties and serve the common good. And they didn't always perform well, but there were moments of glory, like the Pentagon Papers or Watergate, which were kind of bet your papers, bet your reputation, bet your family wealth moments. That's all gone now. Those families are gone. Most newspaper properties, most media properties are publicly owned companies owned by shareholders who are demanding a return. So absent a model which is either a nonprofit model or provides some kind of buffer with profit, newspapers are going to be like everything else in our society, which is if there's no financial model for them, they're not going to exist.
We may have to be here a lot longer. This is actually very interesting, and the point has a lot of implications. Actually talking to one of my classes today at Randolph on the idea that the president, it was proposed by Alexander Hamilton, the president should be lifetime. And the idea was that once you're elected as president, the only thing you care about is your legacy. You don't have to care about being reelected. You don't have to care whether people like you. And so the president will be disinterested in the public interest. Interesting idea. It doesn't happen. Alexander Hamilton was thought it was a coup to even suggest it. But it's interesting in the newspaper model, the family model, which can approach it. It would be interesting to see whether Mr. Bezos has similar ideas, since he's a gazillionaire and maybe he doesn't care. The idea of a model of media where you don't have to be driven by profits raises some interesting good things, but then it also raises back to the gatekeeper issues. We have a few families controlling the media, so it's very interesting. Let's try the 18th century. I realize I'm the person here that likes the 18th century. Jefferson, because I want to get to what do we do about this issue. If it's a serious problem, if the media and newspapers in particular are important to the continuity of the republic, they have an essential role. If this fake news has grown up for lots of different reasons, but it is a serious issue, even if there's also good things going on, as Jeff keeps reminding us. What do we do about it? And Jefferson very much struggled with this. He was brutalized in the newspapers. And some of it fake news, some of it almost hard to call fake news because it was just so obviously, Jefferson is going to take your Bibles and burn them and rape your daughters and so on and so forth. And nobody even thought for a minute that was true, but they understood the point that was being made. Because the media in the 18th century, talk about family-owned, every newspaper was affiliated with a particular political view. You never had any question. I mean, you're reading this newspaper, it's a Federalist newspaper, you're reading this newspaper, it's a Republican newspaper. So Jefferson struggled with this, and one of his answers, curiously, hopefully the foundation's not going to crack, not entirely dissimilar to something Mr. Trump suggested, was the remedy is in the libel laws. And Jefferson, who was opposed to the use of libel laws and sedition laws at the federal level, was all in favor of aggressive prosecution of libel by the state governments. And Mr. Trump, before he was elected, had suggested, gee, maybe we need to open up the libel laws and make the media more susceptible to pain when they print something. So that's one possibility. What do we do about it? You don't necessarily you don't have to buy the libel law.
What's the other choice? The rise of fake news or the fact that the economic model of newspapers is flawed?
No, we're going to be here all night if we go there. Let's stick with fake news.
Well, I think that media literacy is absolutely part of the answer, and I know that that some, I don't know about our own school systems, but I know that there are some school districts that are doing this, and they're having these classes, and even in the middle school middle school level, I think that would be. I would love to be part of something like that. I would love to hear you all's ideas about what we should do about this. I think that thus it has ever been, and it's going to still be here. And for my staff, when we talk about it, I think what we do is we keep doing what we're doing and try not to be thrown off course by this. We'll keep doing what we're doing. Well, I mean, we're covering this week. I hope you all have seen pieces of it. All this. The lockdowns at the forced schools, and now somebody died in Lynchburg, and there seems to be charges about this and that. Well, gosh, we're just reporting the heck out of that, and we're not putting anything. You're not going to see us put anything in print or online until we know that we're right, until we know we've got it verified. And we're unique that way. I would say among some media in this area. And so I think for us, what you do, well, for my people, I think we're just going to keep doing what we're doing. I think you might see us become a little more assertive about how we do that.
Good journalism and being
Sure.
transparent.
Sure. Oh,
about
sure.
good journalism.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that social media really helps with that transparency. And I think that everybody I know who does what I do, or who maybe isn't doing it anymore but used to, they're all pretty invigorated by this fake news. The idea that, well, wait a minute, with this thing, we don't ever want to take that trust for granted, and I don't think we are anymore. So that's another good thing that I think that's coming out of this. But boy, I was hoping when I came tonight that in the Q&A part I could get to ask that question of you all.
I'm going to come to the newspapers, and I'll give you a heads up. I want to talk about the fairness doctrine, whether that has anything to do with what's happening. But I'll like first, what should we do about fake news? Is there anything else?
Well, I think I agree that the problem was caused on the demand side. I think the problem will be solved on the demand side. I think there are some things the platforms can do, especially Facebook, Google, Twitter, and you're beginning to see them edge off of their old position, which was, we're just the pipes, don't blame us, to something else. And that was driven first by ISIS recruiting people on Twitter, and when they started taking down tens of thousands of Twitter accounts, that was the acknowledgement that we're just not a technology company, we're something else. I think you're beginning to see with Facebook, Google, they're trying to figure out what they are, but they haven't had the agonizing discussions that I know that the newspaper families had in previous generations on how do their profit motive align with the common good, because they're publicly owned companies with very high valuations under a lot of pressure from their shareholders. So I think there are some things that platforms can do. They can probably cut the tail off of the kind of most egregious things. Teenagers in Macedonia publishing websites that say, the Pope endorsed Donald Trump or something like that. I think there's an algorithmic solution to that. Then I think the other part is on the demand side, which is if people demand good news, good quality news, they'll get good quality news. And I think here it starts with most of all millennial generation, which is now the largest generation in our society. They outnumber baby boomers. And the usual thing that adults say is, technology, the kids understand it and they're so great at it. Actually, they're clueless. They're very good at the tactile.
They're very deep on that.
They're very good at the tactile manipulation of these devices. If you ask the average, very smart, I've dealt with a lot of very smart undergraduates in Princeton and Colgate at Miami University in Ohio, why do the results of a Google search come out in the order that they do? They will tell you because that's what's germane to me. That's wrong. It has to do with advertising, search engine optimization, other things. The studies show that young people overwhelmingly cannot differentiate between, on a newspaper page or on a website, journalism and so-called native content. That is advertisements which look kind of like news, but funded by the Republic of Georgia at the top of it. And so we have a generation which is actually supposedly born digital, but actually struggling a lot in this area. And then I think adults actually have some of the habits of previous generations, but also face this kind of tsunami of information, good, bad, and indifferent. So I think we're just going to have to be better consumers. I think of it a lot like what we're seeing with food now. So a generation ago, very few people were looking at food labels, at nutritional values, and most people couldn't interpret what they wanted. And there was very little demand for better food on the basis of nutritional value. Now, of course, there's been a revolution. By the way, not finished. But if you look at something like the consumption of diet soda, it's fallen off the table because the American public somehow some way, finally got the message that diet soda is really bad for you. Now, and I think what we're seeing is, and so suddenly organic food aisles are popping up in supermarkets, not because the supermarkets like organic food, but because they realize their customers do, and they will make $1 that way. So I think we're going to have to go through the same kind of evolution with one big exception. The government played a really big role in nutrition by forcing labeling, by forcing the hazards to be noted, and the government can't play that role in news.
What I would segue back to the fairness doctrine, because they used to.
Right.
They used to. And we had it, because I've been reading, I saw someone suggesting that the demise of the fairness doctrine. If you remember the fairness doctrine, the idea was that the especially the airwaves are public property. So if you want to use public property to disseminate your information, the government is going to impose upon you an obligation. It's perhaps not unlike those family-owned newspapers saying we've got a greater interest here. And the government couldn't direct content per se. That would be a violation of the First Amendment. But what the government said is if you are presenting this view, you have to give time to the opposite view. Now, the fairness doctrine is eliminated 87. And it's since 87 that we've seen an explosion of mixed news opinion, radio especially, but also TV, which, Jeff's suggestion is we need educated consumers, and that certainly Facebook, Twitter are starting to do that, although there is a problem. One of the problems, of course, in the campaign was web bots, which are sort of getting around that digital literacy by creating the impression that this news is generated somewhere else or a million people are viewing this news. So it is complicated digitally. But we used to have a government answer, and Jeff said we can't do that. Is the demise of the fairness doctrine part of what leads to this? Newspapers weren't really subject to it because it's a different medium.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I mean, the rise of cable news and 24-hour news, certainly they're filling the airtime with some things sometimes that are more than the news, aren't they? I want to get back to what you were saying. I love that idea about food and organic and let that be so, and maybe there's a solution for what I do. But in Lynchburg, like everywhere else, food deserts all over the place, large amount of poverty in Lynchburg. So if what you say is true, if that's part of the way we're going, then what we're leaving behind a lot of people who can't afford it, don't have access. And we sure worry about that in my region.
Well,
I don't know what the answer is there.
I mean, the fairness doctrine expired because it was technologically irrelevant. I mean,
It became impossible.
Well, no, it didn't become impossible. The spectrum is no longer how most information is broadcast. The spectrum was defined parts of the radio frequency, which television is backed by. But with the advent of cable isn't a public good. Cable is a private good. And now with the arrival of the internet, I mean, that's not publicly provided, so the government has no business imposing. I don't think the fairness doctrine would survive, frankly, legal challenge today. But people will demand, if people demand it, they will get it. I mean, there have been these, I would encourage you to look at them. Lots of people have set up, okay, this is a Facebook page which I've signaled I want conservative news. This is a Facebook page where I've signaled that I want liberal news. And they look, after 3 days, completely different. And they can also say, this is a Facebook page where I've signaled to the algorithms that I want a mix. And you know what? They get a mix because the algorithm doesn't care. It just wants you to stay on Facebook as long as possible. If you watch cat videos or if you read the New York Times, it doesn't care. So if you send out signals, and I don't think that actually has anything to do with income, I'd be more optimistic. I mean, this is people signaling what kind of news they're getting for free, but no, nothing is perfect. But I think we've entered a news world where the consumers matter, where it's not just determined by a few people, but that means the consumers matter. So if you demand bad news, you'll get bad news. So when I came to the museum, the first day they said, you have to follow on Facebook at the very least the most popular news site in the world. News. What do you think? It's the Daily Mail in the UK. is not a high-quality paper. And I do know a lot more about the Kardashians than I do.
I don't have quite Jeff's optimism about the market selling problem. I was reading about this, and Paul Resnick at the University of Michigan says, when people say they're worried about people being misled, what they're really worried about is the other people being misled. And Pew came out with this, and Pew does a lot of good work in this area. Pew does a lot of good work in a lot of areas, but came out with a study not very long ago saying that 84% of people are confident that they can tell what's fake news. That can't possibly work that way. We do want to get to questions. I want to add a pitch for historians because I think the media literacy is important. I'm teaching media literacy, middle schools, high schools, absolutely important. I know historians who are teaching fake news courses now. How do we read the news intelligently? The American Historical Association has been very much focused on this. So historians have a role to play as well. In taking one Jefferson book, the librarian at Monticello, Anna Burks, does just a fabulous job maintaining a website on fake Jefferson quotes. Because it's amazing the things that Jefferson said. You can find unbelievable things, and she does really remarkable work just simply going through every time the Jefferson quote pops up on the internet, where does that come from? Does it come from Jefferson? So, but having said that, let's take some questions from folks. What can we answer for you, please?
Well, I'm wondering how much of this deals with fact and opinion, because when you say that people cancel their subscriptions or add subscription, are they thinking the editorials, the op-eds you carry more than the straight news, or?
A lot different. For me, I'll describe that first. Yes, sometimes it's that, and they see it for that, and they don't like that we had that cartoon about Donald Trump where he looked like the Russian bear, and that is that. And that's that. But a lot of times it is more, and I understand that, and we do try to have a mix on that page. But what I hear just as often, if not more, is, I've got emails that are a problem with me. It's just if I see the Associated Press, the Washington Post, and somebody even said the Richmond Times Dispatch, they just don't read it. They don't believe it. They think it's fake news. And Carolyn, what's happening to your newspaper? And they just don't believe it. Like they won't even read it. They just know that, no, won't read it.
That's what I think. People read what they want to read. You block off the op-ed of the writer you don't believe, and then you read the one, that's just natural selection, I guess.
The citizenry of the audience, however you want to put it, from 1800 all the way up to today more people will vote for Dancing with the Stars and The Voice than will go to the polls. So you have to take those things into consideration. But you also have to understand that families you talked about that in the newspaper, some were Democrats, some were Republicans, some of the newspapers were named the Democrat Chronicle or the Southwestern Republican or whatever, and they espouse a certain point of view, not only in their editorial, but in their writing of stories, and that's the way it was then. So what I'm trying to say is the discerning public is different. The discerning public now will read more stories on the Kardashians than will read on whatever's going on in Washington. And there are plenty of important things going on in Washington. So I think the public has a lot to do with how that's perceived. Everyone in this room is interested in this topic. We wouldn't be here. Think of all the people that are not here that could care less. They are the ones that you have to think about. And when fake news gets out there, when you go to a website and you see government keeping this diabetes cure away from you, and it looks like a news story, some people believe that sort of advertorial type. So I think the public, the citizenry, has to educate itself, and I don't think many people want to do that. We're like you said, about really deep and about that much.
Very consistent with your demand perspective.
Yeah, I think it's easier and cheaper to be really well informed today than ever before. But you do have to make a slight bit more effort than when you could be on receive if you were watching Walter Cronkite reading the New York Times in your local newspaper in the past. If you did those three things, you would be considered in the previous generation a really well-informed American. Today, it's
I'm a great
There are a lot more options. I will say also that one of the reasons people are, a good segment of the society has a critique of what can be called the mainstream media is they've missed a lot of stories that affect a lot of people. So I was in upstate New York for 5 years before I moved to Washington in August of 2015. And the opiate crisis was a huge issue up there. And if you read the New York Times or the Washington Post, you wouldn't know a thing about it. And this was an issue that was causing despair, that has contributed to one of the most shocking things in our society, which is the decline in life expectancy rates for significant portions of our population, like middle and low-income white women. And it was just not covering, because those newspapers have become, national newspapers have become very insular, very coastal. I mean, I buy into a lot of this critique. And they were missing not a little obscure story, they were missing a big story. And then it blew up. And you can look at the electoral map, and if you just overlay the opiate crisis on it, you get an explanation of part of who voted for who, and who the people thought was leading that crisis. So there is there are a lot of critiques out there of newspapers and the newspaper establishment and the media establishment, which are, I think, quite profound. I mean, we're learning now that life expectancy for significant parts of our population are declining. Why didn't we know that before? And that's not some trivial issue. That's people not living as long.
Or the suicide rate, I mean, the despair in white middle-class America. The suicide rate is spiking.
We could switch to healthcare. There's also a study that came out yesterday that life expectancy is higher in Canada than in the United States, partially because of their healthcare system. But we're not going to talk about that. I think of the 18th century issue. I think, as I said at the beginning, great care. I mean, Jefferson, Madison have very important things to say about newspapers and journalism. And absolutely, this idea that this is critical to the functioning of a democracy. The Post, we were talking about before, the Post has changed its masthead. Democracy dies in darkness. Jefferson would absolutely be with that. Madison would absolutely agree with that. One example of why we have to be very careful in transposing what's happening with, again, they're vilified, they're fake news, gerrymandering. And the idea, we talk about fake news, we talk about talking to each other. Well, a gerrymandered political system creates a situation where you can talk to each other and still have political power in a way that they did not think was going to exist in the 18th century. They had a much more fulsome idea of how the republic would operate. So whenever we talk about Jefferson in the 18th century, I think there are very important principles that can be taken, but for the reasons you raise and for many others, one has to be careful.
Well, he did have principles, but he also railed against the newspapers.
Oh yeah, he said his libel law point. He thought newspapers should be. He would not have liked New York Times versus Sullivan, where the Supreme Court, really says you have to. What's the phrase? Open house. What's the standard in New York versus Sullivan? Public figure requires malice. Deliberate malice. So he has a fairly liberal view. Liberal, I don't know his right term. Libel laws he would have had fairly strong.
Did he think the state should prosecute?
States, absolutely.
Not individuals like it is now, but the sort of companies.
Well, no, he thought individuals at the state level.
Oh, okay.
The issue was, what he was upset about in the Adams administration was the Alien Sedition Act made it a federal crime. And he said, this is an outrage. The federal government has no business with this. But the state, he had no problem
It
with
could be handled at the state level, but not the state government actually prosecuting. Got it.
He thought that state libel laws were completely appropriate.
What percent of the population in 1800 read newspapers?
Literacy is remarkably high. I can't tell you what the percentage for the newspapers.
20%?
Excuse me?
20%?
Oh, no, much higher. Literacy in New England is probably well over 80%. Why? I got a student in the room, it's unfair. You have to read the Bible. So literacy in New England is very, very high. Literacy in the middle states, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Maryland, probably 60% plus. In the South, it's less, but still probably 40-50% literacy rates in the South. The newspapers are not delivered at your home, but they are being delivered to the tavern and to the post office. So there's a high degree of literacy in 18th and 19th century America.
Would people read it out loud?
Yes, it would not be uncommon. For example, Common Sense, when Payne comes up with Common Sense, which sells 250,000 copies, which is extraordinary in a country that only has 2.5 million people, 500,000 of whom are African-American enslaved people. But the reports were that people would go and read this out loud to people who were not literate, who would be standing around. So it's more complicated than that, but I don't think literacy would be a big difference. They're a highly literate society. One of the differences between America and most other societies, America is far more literate than, say, England or France at that time. So. Fake news, other thoughts or questions, please?
So you mentioned that the millennial generation is the most connected with social media, which is a huge platform for sharing news and sharing things that look like news that aren't necessarily news. What are some challenges that real journalism has faced with that being integrated into our daily consumption of information, and how can we combat that as journalists?
The fundamental problem is that your generation, if I can use that generalization, doesn't want to pay for the news. That's the problem. That not information wants to be free, and a lot of people, and this, it's not, by the way, not unique to news, it's also a problem with music. A huge problem with music, where people are willing to pay for a Taylor Swift, and she can take her stuff off of Spotify if they don't pay, but they're not willing to pay for a lot of music which is traded and given without violating intellectual property rights. The fundamental problem is we haven't figured out a financial model where news can exist on social media and people will pay for it so that the owners can have a return on investment and the journalists can be paid. There's no model there. And we are messing around with firewalls and this and that. There have been a few publications that have been born digital, Vox, Vice, you'll know them, BuzzFeed, God forbid, but and that have managed to make a go of it, but they're very few and far between. So, and part of the problem is the platforms just keep changing. So, more and more young people are migrating away from Facebook, which is kind of becoming now for moms and pops, right? And they're using Snapchat. So I don't know if you're on Snapchat, but that's really hard to monetize. How are you going to do that? So I think that's the basic problem. If people will earn money for producing high quality news, it'll happen. But right now, I think we're not quite clear that there's no law of nature that says there has to be a financial model that makes it remunerative to produce news. Maybe it's not. In that case, society has to look for other options. But right now, we don't know what to do. And the landscape is changing so quickly that it's hard to make a firm observation.
This is I hit a paywall, and I'm not millennial, as you can probably guess. I hit a paywall on Growl, which I know better. I should know. Look, there's a reason.
Right. You should be happy with that.
But I get copyright. I get to have people paying me for copyright, and I hit a paywall on Growl. You find a way around it.
There's a lot of ways around it.
Is it that people don't want to pay, or they don't want to pay what's being asked? And I ask that because I recently purchased a subscription to the New York Times when they were having that $6 a month sale, but I never paid for the news in advance because it's over $100 a year. And so $6 for the New York Times that does investigative hard journalism, and the news in advance
Sure, 99
that just does reporting the local news.
Sure.
Doesn't.
No, we understand that, and I always say, don't put me in charge of advertising because I give it away. I mean, if I can give it away, I'll give it away, So I understand that, and and I think a lot of people in our business do. Yet, we have in my newsroom 36 people. Well, they deserve to be paid. Of course they do. They don't make anything. These kids out of college, that always makes me feel great when we have an opening and we still get so much interest. But it's expensive, and nobody does what we do. So we think that what we do is, that we think it's irreplaceable, and I hope we would charge you, what we would charge you if you were getting home delivery, 7-day home delivery. I think that it's like that or very close to that. With the idea being that it costs us as much to produce it, the news report, and the newspaper that comes with it, because everybody knows that newspapers don't make a secret of that. We're still making most of our money off of the print product, although we're doing better online than we used to. It's expensive, and we think that it's worth paying for. And I, and I hear you, and I read the New York Times too, but no one will tell you about this area the way we do day after day after day after day after day. Nobody does it.
I think that those are two great points, and it brings up something else which we haven't discussed, which is the so-called network effects are really powerful here, which is the New York Times can afford to charge far less than your paper because they have a national and international product where they produced it, on the web. That's it. And so it's the same cost if 1 million people read it or 1 billion people read it. And so, right, the exact same cost. Maybe they have to build it.
I used to work with cable news eyeballs.
But it scales at an unbelievable rate. So they can afford to charge far less than if you have a paper which is defined geographically, and there are only going to be so many people who are ever going to read it. You got to charge probably more, and therefore the winners and the losers, and there'll be some winners in this world, new media world, are going to be pretty sharply defined, and we may see a real consolidation of the news world because we're used to lots of newspapers. Well, some of that has changed. Like New York City used to have 6 daily papers. Now it has 3. Lots of other cities used to have 4 newspapers. Now they have 1. Some have none. And that industry may consolidate with some losses around local detail and some gains around efficiency. And I think we're seeing that. We don't like to think about that. There used to be a lot more accounting firms, or there used to be a lot more this or that, and they consolidate a lot more airlines. And we may see that. And that would be an interesting question because you may have relatively few healthy, very large journalistic enterprises. And do they operate the same way as lots of many smaller journalistic enterprises, or do you worry about their own power? These are issues that are definitely
Right. And if you follow that train of thought, then what are the ramifications for social capital, which is in the tank?
Which is a public good, which is very monetized. Carolyn started out talking about the community and the value of the newspaper to the community, again, something that Jefferson would very much want to. But this economic issue, we all should go home and get this, back, be less concerned about paywalls. Because, some teenager sitting in Macedonia who was making one of the people who got targeted with all this fake news during the election, some guy was making a fortune, and he was just making this stuff up. He was having a great time. But he was getting hits on his way, Hillary Clinton has Parkinson's disease. Boy, people are eating it up. He's making it, sitting around making a lot of money. That doesn't cost anything to do, but reporters cost. We're going to have to have one more question. I see what?
No, I just wanted to ask a question.
Oh, okay.
We can do it.
We'll have 2 more questions.
What effect is it going to have on the media without NPR, National Public Radio?
I'm not convinced that your assumption is true. I'm not convinced that the current budget will go through.
Would it have?
I think it will be a challenge, and it gets back to, again, what people are willing to pay for. It's not central NPR that's so much at threat. It's the local affiliates which get grants and then they feed money back to central NPR. If the government cuts those subsidies, then those stations, central NPR, will be challenged unless they can come up with an alternative. And we'll see if they do. But I think it'll be a challenge. I think many NPR stations perform, especially at the local level, extremely valuable services. But once again, I think that you provide extremely valuable services. I get frustrated with citizens every once in a while who don't, are quite used to paying for others of life's essentials, food and water and heat and all of that, but somehow think that the news should be free. It cannot be.
And another one like NPR, and I agree, the budget is not going to go through in this form, although there's so many brutal cuts that are going to be expensive. Libraries, we were talking beforehand, if the current budget goes through, forget going to the Library of Virginia, for example. What's the long-term implication? Because we all expect to be able to go to libraries for free and have access to those resources. Now, a little different from news, but for historians, that stuff serves a vital purpose, and I believe historians serve a vital purpose for giving us some of that information. So it is very important, but it's not going to go through the way it's written.
But I say this in part because I run a nonprofit institution in Washington, D.C. that has to charge for its financial model. And of course, there are 23 fine museums in Washington, D.C., which are free. And that's a challenge. And the challenge is for us that we have to make a value proposition to the people who come to our door that it's worth paying on a blended average about $15 a person to come into the building. So, now in other cities, that's not that much of an argument. In Washington, D.C., it is the kind of land of the free, and everything is free. You take that economy and run with it, but, we believe that we are making a go of it while having to charge admission, that if you want to learn this, we think, incredibly valuable stuff about the First Amendment, we don't make a profit. It's not a great business to be in, but you have to pay something.
It's interesting. I suggest the libraries be a parallel to news that we don't think of. It's public good. We don't think we should have to pay for it, but who do you think is paying for all those librarians? We have time for two more? We've got time.
What about digital rights management for newspapers? Digital rights management for newspapers. I pay for Newsweek, I pay for News in Advance, Times, Post. There's all these subscriptions. But when I go to music, I play Google Play, I pay Pandora, I pay a monthly fee, and if I go play some music, they get some money. If I play that music, they get some money. Couldn't all of our media get together and do a digital rights management kind of deal where it's kind of a similar model where everybody gets paid and it's only one paywall?
Well, I don't know, but I'll tell you that my paper, which is owned by DH Media, and especially since DH Media came on board, but before then too, we've become really aggressive about our copyright. And we have somebody, who's my favorite title in the building, he's the intellectual rights. And so if we see this, I shouldn't make fun of it because we're dead serious about it, but if we see an image or a story and it's on, especially a business website or something, and they don't have our okay, which they would never get, well, we go after them. So I think that...
Because they don't have the rights.
Yeah, the newspapers have come to see that that's, wow, boy, let's give that away.
If you have a common community for license management.
Well, it does exist. It does exist
But
at
it's
the
an
academic
interesting
level.
notion. Yeah.
I mean, academic, for example, I have access to all of these publications through academic databases. They are extremely expensive. I get them because I teach at Randolph and because I'm technically a faculty member at UVA. If you didn't have those institutional access, the payment for services like LexisNexis, for example, is very high. We're going to have one more question, but an announcement.
By the way, I do think that's part of the future. Micropayments for news articles.
Sort of like newspaper.com, but for current.
And I don't think they have to get together either. I think people can develop different models, but I don't see why you could pay a fraction of a cent or whatever for. I think it's.
I'm scared they're going to lose the immediate revenue. I think the corporations are going to have to make a leap. The newspaper corporations are going to have to make a leap in micropayments to say this is the future, and we may lose something in the interim.
And that is
unwilling right now.
That's exactly right. And declining industries will hang on to existing revenue because they believe that's the only alternative right into bankruptcy, rather than going to something else.
And we have one more question. It's an important announcement. I believe there's a reception downstairs.
Yes, there is. And you will go out that door there behind you and go down the stairs to the reception area, wine and cheese and all that stuff.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, well, one thing that we didn't talk about, and there's a consumer side, and they're doing their thing, but what is the role of journalism schools? Because I was struck by Caroline saying she was taught, fact, fact, fact. You follow the fact, you follow the fact, you follow the fact. And if you look at a lot of these new websites that seem to cater more to opinion, but is a school of journalism play any role in any of this? Or is the school of journalism now more just media business management?
Go ahead, guys. There are excellent journalism schools.
I have a journalism department at Miami, but more importantly, I was recently at Google News and brought my board out to Mountain View to talk with them. And to be a well-trained journalist today is a really hard, exciting thing. So you have to know a fair bit of data analytics because there's actually more facts, more data than ever before. Free, by the way. I mean, Google produces a lot of it, but you have to know how to use that. You're probably going to be multi-platform. You're probably not just writing, you're tweeting, you're doing video, and you're probably doing it all by yourself. So I think a newspaper, to say I'm a good journalist candidate at 23 to 24, and what you have to know today is really pretty daunting. I mean, just in the data side, it's hard. I mean, I forced through, with the chair of my journalism department, a requirement that all journalism majors take one course in statistics. And a lot of people said, what? And we said, yeah, I mean, it's pretty hard to be able to explain facts to people unless you know how to interpret data. So I think there's a great deal for them to do. I will also say that journalism majors are going to a far more diverse set of places than before, in part because the school is very honest. So most deans will say to the freshman class, you're not getting a job at the Washington Post. Okay? And you may be doing something very different than you thought. You may be writing long stories for BP. You may be doing all kinds of other things that you didn't expect. But we're going to give you a basic set of skills of not only writing, but sort of technological and data analytic prowess that will be very helpful for your career.
I think you can't get away. I think this is absolutely correct. I think it's very hard to get away from the demand side because I'll switch to the history side. The most popular historians that you read about, and I won't ask for names or mention names, are just crap from a historic perspective. Many of them happen to be, by the way, journalists. Without it, people writing history books that don't have the background in history to provide those books, and a historian who has academic training can go through and say, that's wrong, they misunderstood this, they missed this movement. So, we've come, again, we have somebody who says, gee, I love uneducated people in the White House. Okay, I understand the problems of elitism. Believe me, I got middle-class credentials for everybody in this room. But there is a problem when we start to disrespect education, that it matters. Education matters, whether it's history or whether it's journalism. And that we really do a disservice when we don't respect the value of journalism degrees. But with that preaching, why don't we all go off and hope Carolyn and Jeff will join us downstairs.
And thank you all for coming out tonight, our paying customers. We really appreciate your support.